take a moment and think about a single memorable experience you've had with government. People are already laughing. So what emotions did you have that were associated with that experience? And then how would you describe those emotions? Were they positive? Not so positive? Indifferent? Something else? Now, set aside that single experience and try to think about your aggregate experience with government. Over time, all of your experiences with government, how do you feel about it? What emotions does that sort of conjure up? Do you look forward to it? Do you avoid it? Is it more indifference or something else? Something else. So, while I fully acknowledge that most folks on a day-to-day basis are not thinking about their interactions with government, that's perfectly fine. I believe as citizens, we're all citizens somewhere, that we should expect really good experiences when we do need to interact with government. We should expect that. And so hopefully we can explore that a little bit today. So I'm Sean O'Kelly. I'm the CIO for Financial and Professional Regulation at the state of Illinois. I joined the state 2 years ago in this role, and I spent 20 years prior to that in the private sector. Throughout that time, I have really focused more heavily in my career on creating great customer experiences. I joined government with the idea that can we extend that background? Can I extend that background and bring that experience to create great citizen experiences? So with that, I think we need a little bit of a model to talk about how to do that. First, a little bit on the agenda we're going to talk about today. So I want to define what we mean, or what I mean by a citizen experience. Why you should care. We'll spend a little bit of time going into a framework around how I think about it and maybe how you should think about it or could think about it. Talk about a few examples, a little bit on technology, but not too deep, and then what you can do to participate. And that's intentional. I don't want to go too deep into technology because the technology tools are available. The question is how do we get the right experiences defined? So when we talk about defining the citizen experience, what does that mean? We may all have something a little different that we think about. I'll tell you what it means to me. I'm from Chicago, Illinois, and the city of Chicago has a few great mobile apps that people really like. One of those apps that I use frequently is for paying for street parking, where you need to pay for street parking. And there's probably other cities that have that too. It's really easy. You park, you pull up the app, pay, and go on. You don't have to do anything else. And somewhere along the way, if you're still out throughout the day and you're away from your car and you need to renew that parking, you can do it right from the app. You don't need to go back to the car and feed a meter. It's a really, really good experience. So those experiences exist in pockets. So when I asked the question think about an experience you have with government, hopefully some of you thought of some positive experiences. Those positive experiences exist in pockets around the country, around the world. But the question is, on the net, are we really providing those experiences? Can we extend that to all of our interactions or more of our interactions with government? Unfortunately, what's more common, from my point of view, is that the experiences are more still in 2019, filling out of paper forms, manual interactions, which often involve sometimes having to go to a facility and talk to somebody still, submitting data and documents, oftentimes multiple times. So how do we go from that to something that feels a little more modern? How do we do that? How do we make it better? And so the way I start to frame the citizen experience, or quite frankly, any experience, the way I think about it is that there's 5 components: process, data, security, trust, and technology. But I specifically put process and data at the very top, because if you have all the greatest technology tools and even the greatest security, if you don't define the right experience, then it's not going to matter. So obviously, process is just a collection of steps or events that collectively total up to some experience. You got to get that right. Sometimes we call them journeys, but I think we're at a point where that's been happening in the private sector for quite some time, maybe out of necessity, and I think we're at a point where we need to really start focusing on that in the government space. Data is the other big one, because data obviously requires that you have well-organized data. It needs to be clean data so that you can gather insights and it's useful to you. And it provides feedback into the process you're trying to create. I know probably most of the folks here know that, but as we know, or as we probably have experienced in government, that doesn't always happen the way that we would like. So the idea is to focus on process and data, and the technology is there, the tools are there. So specifically in government, what are we talking about? You have, along the bottom there, you have services around identity. At the federal level in the United States, it's passports and social security numbers. At the state, it's state IDs and driver's licenses. And you even have some municipal identifiers that are emerging. There's regulatory compliance. That's what we're going to focus on in our examples today, by the way, is a little bit on regulatory compliance. That's the general process of licensing and enforcing against those licenses. That might include exams, inspections, those sorts of activities. There's government services, healthcare services, retirement benefits that you've earned over time. Those count as interactions with government. Citizenship, voting, taxes, records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, real estate, other property like auto, and boats, and that sort of stuff. Those are all records that are maintained by government. Judicial processes, court cases, and there's others too. This is not meant to be a comprehensive list. So how do we make those interactions better? That's really what I'm trying to focus on. So why should you care? You're more likely to interact with government at the state and local level to get a permit, to get a license, to participate in a court proceeding, to receive services, to vote, those sorts of things, than you are to participate or be impacted by anything that's happening at the federal level. And so if our collective experience is that we're still dealing with paper, we're still dealing with forms and documents, still having to submit them to multiple agencies, I think it can be so much better. It does not need to be that way. The technology is there, the tools are there. It's ready for disruption. A few related questions. I don't actually know the answer to these, but I want to sort of pose these to the group that I certainly have contemplated is, does your experience impact your attitude toward government? So if you went for a license, let's say you went for a fishing permit or something like that, and it didn't go well, and there was some delay or something like that happened, does it actually impact how you feel about government? It's a good question. Take that a step further. Does it impact the way you vote? If it does, then I think it's more of a case that it's time to make these experiences better. Because we should have good experiences with government. So there's research to back this up too. This is a recent quote from McKinsey. where they're talking about really driving out great citizen experiences to ultimately lead to better outcomes at a faster pace. And implied there, of course, might be some lower costs too. Not only for the citizens, but for government itself. So there's multiple kind of motivating influences here. So we need a model to kind of work from, a model to start from that helps us start to illustrate or picture what's going on and create a framework for starting to address it. So this is a model I've kind of thought of and put together. It's really based off of Porter's value chain. So imagine that this is just a single private sector entity doing what it does. You've got certain make activities. There's supply chain that is an input into operations, and you make something, you produce something. That could be a good, it could be a service, it could be software, it could be something you manufacture. Doesn't matter. Point is that from a regulatory perspective, you're looking at those make or production activities. Every organization in the private sector, of course, has its distribution capabilities. So, in other words, how it sells what it makes. That could be online, that could be through partnerships and alliances, it could be through sales team, it could be through any of those mechanisms, any combination. And then you also have your consumer side, your buy activities. And at a high level, consumers, of course, are either other businesses or, I guess, governments or nonprofits or individuals, citizens. So at a high level, when we think about sort of Porter's value chain, add in the consumer, that's not part of the value chain, but when we think about that sort of delivery chain, that's the model that I think about when I think about how to improve citizen experiences. So related to that is support. You've got HR, IT, finance activities as well. And collectively, though, in order to improve any of this, you need to look at process at the right level. That's true for any organization. Think about your organizations. You have to think about it at the right level. What does that mean? Well, within supply chain, within operations, within distribution, you have all kinds of sub-processes and sub-nested things that are going on. And if you get too deep into the weeds, for anybody who's solved problems, spent their career solving problems, if you get too deep and too close, you don't end up materially changing what, or disrupting or innovating anything. You maybe make some minor improvements, but you don't materially change anything if you get too deep. If you're too high level, then you don't, then you don't have enough detail to drive change. So you got to get to that right level, but that's an art. That's the trick. That's what everybody's trying to do when they're trying to innovate and disrupt. Get to that right level of innovation so you can understand something enough to figure out what alternatives might be. So in organizational delivery, the way you get that cross-functional coordination and go-to-market of a certain product or service is with a product team. That's kind of the classic model, and that's existed for a long time. And product teams, of course, tell the story around what the value is, whether that's ROI or EBITDA or any other kind of value measure you want to use. But they're also incorporating, hopefully, if they're a successful product team, the voice of the customer in some way or another. And they're focusing on what the customer need really is. So you get that focus on what that customer journey is. And you tell the story from the perspective of the customer. We all know that. If you are working for a company or starting a company or working in nonprofit or government, you know that you should tell the story from the perspective of the customer. There might be multiple customers. So you need to incorporate that. But if you want to do that, if you want to get to the right experience, you need to do that. So now let's abstract that out from a single entity to a regulatory layer and add the regulatory layer. So now imagine an industry with multiple entities that are being regulated by government. But in effect, it's still the same model. You can abstract that out, you can add all kinds of new entities, but it's still the same model. And so when you look at how government regulates licensing and enforcement activities, it generally is doing it across multiple departments based on the expertise of those departments. So you can generally align those with your make activities. So in here we've got a hypothetical Department A with licensing and enforcement activities. We've got another department that might be aligned with the sell activities. And yet, in some cases, another department that's aligned with those buy activities. Not always, but sometimes. So the question is how do you get that analog in government, analog to the product team that might exist in the private sector, how do you get that into government? That right there. That doesn't really naturally exist. That analog doesn't naturally exist in government. And it gets even more complicated if you're talking about multiple levels of government. In some processes, as we know, with like real estate transactions, you may have government interactions that are at the state level and at the county level, or county and state, or state and city. Something like that. So there's not a natural analog. So you get this siloed experience. That's what the dotted lines represent. This siloed experience. We want to break that. We should want to break that. If we're going to get to better customer experiences, we should want to break that. Better citizen experiences. So let's look at an example. This is cannabis. The state of Illinois, literally last Friday, the legislature just passed recreational cannabis in Illinois. That's going to happen, it looks like. And so let's use that as an example. In this case, the regulated entity in the make space is your seed providers for your supply chain and your growers, and that's going to be regulated by agriculture. Makes sense. They have the expertise to regulate farming. Okay, but unfortunately, it's still, in some cases, still very paper-based, manual, document-based. You move over to those distribution activities under the cell. That's my department. We're going to regulate the dispensaries. They're the ones that are going to be legally able to do that. Finally, the buy for the citizens. In some cases, in medical cannabis, you still want to permit buyers so you know folks are taking what they're prescribed. There's banking side to it as well. So you want to make sure that the companies involved in this industry are receiving their income from, from where they're supposed to be receiving it from. But again, there's not necessarily a cross-coordination going on there. And so you get that siloed experience. What I think is that the regulatory layer should more closely resemble or more closely mirror that end-to-end citizen experience across all of those entities involved in this entire industry. So another example of this is business regulation. You could take that same cannabis company and say, okay, how do we get them even just set up as a business, even just before you even get to the operations at the far right? First, you got to go to the Secretary of State. You got to get set up as an entity. You got to get set up for taxation and revenue. You got to get set up with other departments through environment, unemployment, or employment security, health and safety. And there may be others too. This is meant to be a comprehensive set. But the point is that there's a lot that has to happen in order to just stand up a business. So a clear business journey would help define that, and then we could leverage technology to facilitate that. But it has to be the right journey. And depending on the company, the journey may be somewhat different, and that's okay. That's how it should be. So with that, there's other industries as well that this touches. This theme plays out across nearly every industry. Could be financial services, insurance, energy, doesn't matter. And this isn't comprehensive either. Healthcare is another big one. But it's this same theme where you're going to have, we need to better define those journeys to help us identify the process and the data that's needed to create better experiences. That plays out everywhere. Just a little bit on technology, just a hair. So this goes back to that cannabis example. And the thinking is, over time, as you add in layers of technology, could be cloud, blockchain, You add in your containers and your microservices to create ecosystems. You can quickly deploy things. What'll happen is those silos start to disappear. The ecosystem comes together. The partition disappears. In theory, that's what would happen. And so what you end up with is an ecosystem where you have entities that are participating in their transactions, and governance is automatically built into the ecosystem. And so you smooth out that process. You make the experience better. And again, this is just regulatory compliance. There were all those other categories that we haven't even had time to touch on today. So when we talk about blockchain, AI, cloud, we're talking containers. We're talking about those things to automate, to create the right ecosystems and create the right experiences. One little quick side note on technology. This was a paper put out by the Federal Reserve Bank around banking regulation earlier this year. This had one interesting section in it about what they called a supervisory node. And it was, I think, one of the first green shoots around how bank regulation could occur in a blockchain ecosystem. They actually have a section in there called the supervisory node. So something to check out. What can you do? Sure, there's all kinds of challenges around stakeholder alignment, cultural change, budgets, purchasing, those sorts of things. But support candidates that talk about better experiences. Serve in government. I think everyone's a citizen somewhere. Serve in government. And finally, contact your government officials. Make your desire for that known. Thank you. Let's continue the conversation. Feel free to connect.